Picture the moment they want you to picture. A stadium goes quiet, an athlete laces up a pair of shoes with a small curved line on the side, exhales, and does something no human body was supposed to be able to do. The crowd loses its mind. And somewhere in that noise, without a single word being spoken, a company sells you a feeling. That feeling is greatness, and the price of admission is whatever they decide to print on the box. This is the version of Nike everyone agrees to believe. A company built by runners for runners. A track coach and one of his athletes pouring rubber into a waffle iron in Oregon because they loved the sport and hated the shoes. Just do it. Bo knows the swoosh that means victory. Nike, in the story it tells about itself, is not really a business at all. It is a religion with a very good marketing department, and you are either a believer or you are jogging in something worse. And the founding myth is real enough to be dangerous. Nike started as Blue Ribbon Sports, a company that did not make shoes at all. It imported them from Japan and sold them out of the trunk of a car at track meets. For years, the entire business was buying someone else's sneakers cheap and selling them for a little more. That detail matters because the company that would one day be worth more than every rival combined began its life as a middleman. Nike's origin was never manufacturing. It was arbitrage. It just took the world 50 years to notice that it never really stopped. And the numbers seem to back the myth. Nike does something like $46 billion a year in revenue. It has been, for stretches of the last decade, the single most valuable apparel brand on the planet, worth more than the next several competitors combined. Its logo is recognized in places where its shoes have never officially been sold. It signs the best athletes in the world before the world has heard of them. If you wanted proof that building a great product and believing in it hard enough makes you rich, Nike is Exhibit A. Except almost none of that is how the money actually works. Here is the fact that breaks the story. Nike does not make shoes. Not really. It owns almost no factories. The overwhelming majority of the sneakers with a swoosh on them are manufactured by contractors in Vietnam, Indonesia, and China. Hundreds of factories that Nike does not own. Staffed by workers Nike does not employ, using machines Nike did not buy. Roughly half of all Nike footwear in recent years has come out of Vietnam alone. At its core, Nike is not a manufacturer that got good at marketing. It is a marketing and design company that outsourced the shoes. The physical object you think you are buying is the part of the business Nike cares about least. So if Nike isn't in the business of making shoes, what is it actually selling? Follow the money and the answer gets uncomfortable. A pair of Nike sneakers that retails for $130 costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $25 to $30 to manufacture and ship. That figure is an estimate built from the company's own margins, but it is not far off. It is not a scandal, but that is the entire design of the company. The gap between what a shoe costs to make and what you will pay for it is not a markup. It is the product. Nike sells the difference between a commodity and a symbol, and it has spent 50 years and tens of billions of dollars making sure that difference feels worth it. You can see the trick most clearly in the technology. Air cushioning, the little pocket of pressurized gas in the sole, is a genuine piece of engineering, but its real job was never mechanical. When Nike put a window in the sole so you could see the air unit, it did something no cushioning system needed to do. It made the technology visible. You cannot see comforts. So Nike gave you a window to look at, a word to say, a thing to point to that justified the price. The tech is real. The window is marketing. And that is the whole company in a single design decision. Take something functional and wrap it in a reason to pay more. To understand how that machine got built, you have to look at what it actually costs to run this business, not the romance, the capital. And the capital is enormous, just not where you would expect. Nike does not spend its money on factories. It spends it on demand. In a given year, Nike will pour somewhere around $4 billion into what it calls, in its own filings, demand creation. That is the corporate euphemism for marketing. The endorsements, the ad campaigns, the sponsorships, the shoes handed to the right 18-year-old before anyone knows his name. $4 billion every year spent not on making the product better, but on making you want it more. That is the real cost of entry into Nike's business, and it is a moat almost nobody can cross. Think about what that number does to a competitor. A startup can design a better running shoe. It can find the same factories in Vietnam, literally the same ones because Nike doesn't own them. It can match the materials, the cushioning, the fit. What it cannot do is casually spend $4 billion a year reminding the entire human species that its logo means winning. The shoe was never the barrier. The barrier is the brand, and the brand is bought with a fire hose of cash aimed at your subconscious from the time you are old enough to watch sports. Even the slogan was a purchase of meaning over substance. Just do it. 3 words that became one of the most valuable pieces of language in commercial history. It was reportedly inspired by the last words of a man about to be executed. Nike took a phrase with nothing to do with athletics and welded it onto the idea of pushing through your own limits. It cost almost nothing to write, and it has sold tens of billions of dollars in product. That is the business in miniature. The raw material is cheap, and the meaning is everything. And the endorsements are their own quiet arithmetic. When Nike signs a generational athlete, it is not paying for a spokesperson. It is buying an association it can rent back to you at a premium for decades. The Jordan deal is the one everyone knows. A rookie in 1984, a shoe that was supposed to move a few $100,000 in its first year and instead did over $100 million. But the point isn't that Nike got lucky with Michael Jordan. The point is that Nike built an entire financial instrument out of him. The Jordan brand alone now generates several $billion a year, decades after the man last played a professional game. Nike didn't sell his talent. It securitized his myth. And it has run that play again and again. Lifetime deals worth a reported $1 billion to a single basketball player. Sponsorship contracts with national teams and leagues that lock out every rival for a decade at a stretch. Nike figured out early that an endorsement is not an expense. It is an asset with a depreciation schedule. If you pick the right athlete, the asset appreciates long after the checks stop. The money going out the door looks like marketing. On the balance sheet of the brand, it is capital. So that's the engine. But the engine has a specific, counterintuitive shape, and it's worth naming exactly. Nike's real business is the manufacture of scarcity around an object that is not actually scarce. There is no shortage of rubber and foam. There is no shortage of factory capacity. Nike could flood the world with sneakers tomorrow, and it deliberately does not. The moment a Nike shoe is easy to get, it stops being a Nike shoe and starts being footwear. The limited drops, the raffles, the lines around the block, the resale market where a shoe that cost $30 to make trades for $2,000, none of that is an accident. That is the product working exactly as designed. Nike learned that the surest way to protect a premium is to make people afraid they will miss it. This is why the sneaker resale market matters so much to a company that, on paper, makes no money from it. When a pair of Jordans resells for 10 times retail, Nike does not see a cent of that transaction. But it sees something better, proof. Every resale headline, every teenager flipping a shoe for rent money, is a free advertisement for the idea that a Nike shoe is an asset, not a purchase. The company gets to sell you the base model at full price precisely because a secondary market it doesn't control keeps insisting the base model is worth more than you paid. Nike engineered a world where its own customers do the marketing and pay for the privilege. Nothing proved this better than the moment Nike bet its brand on a controversy. When it built an ad campaign around an athlete who had knelt during the national anthem, the immediate reaction was people filming themselves burning the shoes they had already paid for. On paper, that is insane. You have angered a chunk of your own customers into destroying your product. But Nike understood the math the outrage did not. It was not selling shoes to the people burning them. It was buying, for the price of a news cycle, an unshakable association with conviction in the eyes of the customers it actually wanted. Sales climbed. The brand got sharper, not softer. Nike had discovered that in the business of meaning, being loved by the right people is worth being hated by the rest, and that a boycott you plan for is just advertising you don't have to pay full price for. And underneath all of it sits the number that makes the whole structure work: gross margin. Nike runs a gross margin in the mid-40s as a percentage, which means that of every dollar that comes in, roughly 44 cents is left after the cost of actually getting the shoe made and delivered. For a company that sells physical objects, that is an extraordinary figure. It is the financial signature of a business that has convinced the world its commodity is a luxury. That margin is what pays for the $4 billion in demand creation. The marketing sells the shoes fund the marketing, and the whole thing spins faster the bigger it gets. Which brings us to the flywheel, the part every business school case study loves and every business school case study gets slightly wrong. The story goes, Great athletes wear Nike, so people want Nike, so Nike makes money, so Nike can sign more great athletes. True enough, but the real flywheel is subtler and more ruthless. Nike's scale lets it outspend everyone on demand. Outspending everyone on demand lets it charge a premium. The premium funds a margin nobody else in the category has, and that margin funds the scale. It is not a story about shoes at all. It is a machine for converting brand dominance into pricing power and pricing power back into brand dominance, with the actual product spinning along for the ride. But every machine built this cleanly has a specific way of breaking, and Nike's traps are exactly the flip side of its strengths. The first one is the factory problem. When you own no factories, you own no fate. Nike's entire cost structure sits at the mercy of countries it does not control. When Vietnam shut down during the pandemic, Nike didn't have a supply chain hiccup. It lost months of production. It had no way to replace because there was no Nike factory to keep running. Shoes that should have been on shelves for the holidays were still unmade in shuttered plants an ocean away. The asset might not reopen a factory you never built. The second trap is tariffs, and it is the same wound from a different angle. A company that makes almost everything it sells in Vietnam and China is a company whose entire cost base can be rewritten by a politician in an afternoon. A new tariff on Vietnamese footwear doesn't nick Nike's margins. It aims a rifle at the exact seam the whole business is built on, and Nike has spent decades arbitraging the gap between cheap foreign labor and rich Western wallets. That arbitrage is a policy decision away from closing, and there is no factory in Oregon waiting to catch the shoes. The company that started as an importer is, at the deepest level, still an importer, and importers live and die by the rules at the border. There is a third version of the same wound, and it points the other way across the ocean. China. For Nike, China is not just a place that makes shoes. It is one of the largest and most profitable places that buys them, a market that for years grew faster and earned fatter margins than anywhere else. That is a spectacular asset and a spectacular exposure at the same time. A company that manufactures in Asia and increasingly sells into Asia has bet both halves of its business on staying welcome in the same region. When public mood in China turned against Western brands over a statement about labor practices, Nike watched shelves clear and endorsements evaporate almost overnight. The same concentration that made the growth story so clean is the concentration that makes it fragile. When your factory and your fastest growing customer share a border, one political gust hits you twice. The next trap is the one Nike walked into with its eyes open, the direct-to-consumer gamble. For most of its life, Nike sold through other people's stores, Foot Locker, department stores, the mall. Then it decided the middleman was taking a cut it wanted for itself. It pulled its products off shelves to sell straight to you through its own apps and stores. The logic was flawless on a spreadsheet. Cut the wholesaler, keep the margin, own the customer. Direct-to-consumer sales climbed toward half the business. What the spreadsheet didn't say was that those shelves were also discovery. When Nike walked away from the mall, it walked away from the place where casual buyers stumbled onto its shoes. It handed that shelf space to competitors who were happy to be found. The margin was real. So was the hole where the foot traffic used to be. Years later, Nike would quietly go crawling back to the very retailers it had abandoned. It turned out the middleman had been selling something Nike couldn't make itself, the accident of being seen. And the direct model exposed a second problem Nike had been hiding from itself: inventory. When you sell through wholesalers, they eat the risk of shoes that don't sell. When you sell direct, you own every unsold pair. In 2022, Nike found itself sitting on a mountain of product it had ordered into a supply chain that lurched from empty to flooded. It had to slash prices to move it. For a company whose entire identity is that its shoes never go on sale, a season of markdowns is not just lost margin. It is a crack in the myth. Every discounted Jordan is a quiet admission that the price was never really about the shoe. The fourth trap is the slowest and the most dangerous because it looks like success right up until it isn't. It is the trap of becoming ubiquitous. The entire value of the swoosh rests on it meaning something: greatness, exclusivity, the thing the best athletes wear. But the growth machine demands you sell more shoes every single quarter, forever, to more people, in more places. And the more people who own the shoe, the less the shoe says about the person wearing it. Nike is in a permanent war with its own scale. It has to sell enough to satisfy Wall Street and few enough to stay special, and those two commands point in opposite directions. Every mass market brand that ever lost its cool lost it this exact way. Not to a better product, but to being everywhere. And there is a fifth, quieter trap sitting under all of them. The company sold a myth, and myths curdle. When your brand stands for the character of the athletes who wear it, every athlete is a liability as well as an asset. Nike has spent fortunes building associations that a single scandal, a single bad night, a single change in public mood can turn from an asset into a headline. The same securitized myth that prints money when the story is good is a leveraged bet against the story going bad. You do not get the Jordan upside without carrying the human downside, and the bigger the association, the bigger the fall if it comes. There is a whole graveyard of athletes Nike paid a fortune to build up and then paid lawyers a second fortune to quietly walk away from. There is even a trap in the counterfeits. A brand valuable enough to fake is a brand under permanent siege. Billions of dollars in knockoff Nikes move through the world every year, and each one is a strange kind of compliment and a real kind of threat. Proof the swoosh is worth stealing, and a slow leak in the scarcity that gives it worth. Nike spends real money policing something it cannot fully stop. The counterfeit and the collector's item are two faces of the same fact. The logo is worth far more than the shoe it sits on, and everyone knows it. So let's run the two versions of how this ends, because both are live right now. In the version that works, Nike remembers what it actually sells. It treats the swoosh like the only real asset it owns, because it is, and it protects it the way a central bank protects a currency. It keeps the drops scarce and the myth intact. It rebuilds the bridges to the retailers it abandoned, accepting a thinner margin on some sales in exchange for being found again. It diversifies the factories out of any single country, so no tariff and no lockdown can hold it hostage. And it keeps its demand creation fire hose aimed at the one thing no competitor can copy. Not the shoe, the meaning. In this version, the machine keeps spinning because the people running it never forgot that they are in the business of desire. The shoe is just the thing. Desire happens to be printed on. In the version that fails, Nike believes its own myth. It assumes the swoosh is permanent, so it stops paying the $4 billion a year that made it permanent and lets the margin swell. It chases every quarter's growth by selling more, everywhere, to everyone, until the shoe that meant greatness means nothing more than a shoe. It clings to the direct-to-consumer dream long after the foot traffic is gone, discounts its way through one bloated season after another, wakes up one morning to find that a generation of kids discovered a different logo in the space it vacated. Nothing dramatic happens. There is no single bad year. The brand just quietly stops being a symbol and becomes what it always physically was, $30 of rubber and foam, sold by a company that forgot. The other $100 was the entire point. That is the real economics of Nike, not a shoe company. A machine for manufacturing the difference between what something costs and what you will pay, powered by a myth it rents to you one pair at a time. It began as a middleman selling other people's shoes out of a car, and after 50 years and $46 billion a year, it is still, in the way that matters most, exactly that. A middleman between a cheap object and an expensive feeling. The genius was never the sneaker. The genius was convincing the entire world that the sneaker was the product while quietly selling something you can't put on your feet. The swoosh doesn't cost $30.